You are waking up one day to find out you're the secret daughter of a billionaire. That's exactly what happened to Amelia Hayes, a small-town waitress who gets thrown into the glitzy, cutthroat world of New York's elite. A whirlwind of drama and high-stakes decisions as Amelia fights to figure out who she really is. But what happens when she learns the one secret that could change everything? I'm your host, Josh, and it's an absolute pleasure to share this story with you. Amelia Hayes never thought her life was extraordinary. She'd grown up between foster homes, part-time jobs, and endless wondering. For her, family was a concept that existed only for other people. Like in those shows where moms baked cookies and dads coached Little League. For her, it had always been just Amelia and her mother's locket, the one thing her mother had left her. The silver pendant, shaped like a delicate heart, was her only keepsake of a woman she barely remembered. So, when the lawyer walked into the diner that afternoon, Amelia thought he'd gotten lost. People in Caldwell, Ohio wore jeans to work and called that dressing up. This man was in a suit that looked like it had a comma in the price tag, his shoes polished to a ridiculous shine, and his posture stiff, like he was preparing for an interview instead of a conversation over greasy coffee and hash browns. He cleared his throat as she finished wiping down the last of the lunch tables. "Miss Hayes?" She glanced at him, still holding her damp cloth, half expecting him to announce he'd made a wrong turn somewhere between reality and fantasy. "Yeah? My name is Edward Lawson." He adjusted his tie, clearly unused to environments where menus stuck to the table. "I'm an attorney representing a Mr. Daniel Hayes." She blinked, barely registering his words. The name meant nothing to her, and she was already waiting for whatever scam would come next. "Okay. And?" Edward's face softened, almost sympathetically. "Mr. Hayes believes he may be your father." Her mind went blank. She just stared, the world tilting slightly as she processed what he'd just said. "Excuse me? Your father," he repeated, calmly, as though he'd simply informed her of today's specials. "Mr. Hayes has only recently discovered your existence." It was an unexpected revelation for him as well. Amelia felt her pulse throb in her neck, a mix of disbelief, anger, and something unnameable, a feeling she'd been avoiding since she was a little girl. A father? Now? For years, she'd trained herself not to think about her parents. If she imagined the family she didn't have, she'd start feeling like she'd lost something, and loss was a feeling she couldn't afford. But now, this man, with his two shiny shoes and his perfectly rehearsed face, was trying to tell her she had a father, and a father named Daniel Hayes, who suddenly cared about finding her. "Look," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I've had a few people show up over the years, claiming to have answers about my real family. They all turned out to be lying. So if this is some kind of joke, you can save us both the time." Edward didn't blink. "I understand your hesitation, and I'm aware this must be difficult to believe. But Mr. Hayes genuinely wishes to meet you. He has asked me to extend an invitation for you to come to New York City." New York City. She'd barely made it out of Caldwell. And now, someone from a world she couldn't imagine was inviting her to Manhattan. "Why now?" she asked, the words sharp and defiant. "Why would he want to meet me after 25 years? Edward sighed, as though he'd had this conversation before. Sometimes people don't realize what truly matters until later in life. Mr. Hayes regrets the lost time. He would like a chance to make amends. She looked down, her fingers clutching the locket she hadn't let go of since she was 6. It had always been her anchor, her one reminder that she came from somewhere, even if she didn't know where. And now, after years of quiet, someone was claiming to have answers? "And if I don't want to go?" she asked, her tone deliberately flat. "I understand," Edward replied, his tone professional but not unkind. "But you may find this opportunity brings you more than you expect. Mr. Hayes is willing to cover all your expenses and provide accommodations for a brief stay. He simply asks for the chance to meet his daughter." The word daughter hung in the air, echoing in her mind, and she couldn't help the flicker of curiosity that slipped past her defenses. She'd spent her entire life building walls around that empty space where her family should have been. But maybe she was tired of the unknown. Maybe just this once, she could take the risk of letting someone in. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "1 week. That's all I'll promise." Edward's relief was evident as he nodded. "Thank you, Miss Hayes. I'll make all the arrangements." With that, he handed her a sleek envelope and left, his polished shoes clicking against the diner's scuffed floor. The envelope felt impossibly out of place in her hands, too heavy, too luxurious, like something that belonged in someone else's life. Inside was a plane ticket, a hotel reservation, and an address in Manhattan. A penthouse suite that sounded straight out of a movie. Amelia walked home in a daze, her thoughts spinning with questions she couldn't even begin to answer. That night, as she lay in bed, she held her mother's locket tightly in her hand, letting the cool weight of it ground her. "What am I even doing?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the quiet of her tiny apartment. But she knew. Somewhere beneath the fear and uncertainty, she felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this journey would give her the answers she'd been searching for. New York City looked like another world. Amelia watched from the back seat of a sleek black car as the driver navigated the streets, barely noticing how close he came to the buses, bikes, and taxis zooming past. Buildings stretched so high she wondered if they actually touched the sky, and the people, all moving like they were late for something important, made her feel like she'd stepped into a movie set. She'd seen New York on TV, of course, but in real life, it was bigger, louder, and overwhelming in a way that made her heart race. She took a shaky breath, trying to ignore the butterflies in her stomach as she clutched her bag. Just 2 days ago, she'd been wiping down tables in Caldwell, Ohio, and now she was on her way to meet a man who claimed to be her father, in a city that felt like it was swallowing her whole. She hadn't dared tell anyone back home. How could she explain this without sounding like she'd lost her mind? "Here we are, miss," the driver announced, pulling up to a towering building made of steel and glass. Its sleek surface reflected the city lights, glowing against the backdrop of the late afternoon sky. Amelia climbed out of the car, gripping her bag tightly as she glanced up at the building. She half expected to find a red carpet and a line of paparazzi, but the entrance looked surprisingly ordinary. Just a man in a perfectly pressed suit, standing guard by the glass doors, waiting. "Miss Hayes?" the doorman asked with a polite smile, stepping aside as if she'd been expected all along. "Please, follow me." She swallowed, her pulse racing as she nodded, following him into the lobby. It was all white marble and gleaming gold accents, polished to a mirror shine. Even the air smelled expensive, like leather and fresh-cut flowers. She tried to look casual, but every step felt like it was echoing a bit too loudly in the silence. The doorman led her to an elevator with walls lined in dark wood and mirrors that made the small space feel endless. When the doors closed, she felt a twist in her stomach as they shot upward, faster than she'd ever experienced in the old, creaking elevators back in Caldwell. Finally, the doors slid open with a quiet chime, revealing a penthouse hallway lined with artwork that probably cost more than her entire apartment. Amelia stepped out, half expecting the doorman to lead her further, but he stayed behind as the doors closed. She was alone. Just as she turned to double-check the door number, it opened. And there he was. Daniel Hayes was not what she expected. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, and a gaze that seemed to assess everything with a single look. He wore an impeccably tailored suit, but there was something in his expression that wasn't quite as polished. A flicker of hesitation. Almost like he was just as unsure about this as she was. "Amelia," he said, his voice smooth and steady, though a little softer than she'd expected. "Thank you for coming." She felt her mouth go dry, her rehearsed questions vanishing the moment she saw him. This was her father? She had no idea what to say, and for a moment they just stared at each other, both trying to figure out how to bridge the gap of 25 years. Hi," she managed, cringing at how small her voice sounded. Not exactly the first impression she'd wanted to make. He gave a small, hesitant smile, gesturing for her to come inside. "Please, make yourself comfortable." Amelia stepped into the penthouse, her eyes widening as she took in the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a breathtaking view of the city, stretching out in every direction, glowing with lights. The room was modern, pristine, and utterly different from the worn, cozy apartments she'd known. She felt like she was in a museum, where everything looked like it was waiting to be photographed. Daniel seemed to notice her hesitation. "Would you like something to drink? Coffee? Tea? Water?" "Water's fine, thanks," she said, taking a seat on one of the white leather couches. She tried not to sink too far back, worried she'd wrinkle it somehow. He poured her a glass from a crystal pitcher, then took a seat across from her, his gaze steady, but unreadable. "I imagine this must be a shock for you," he began, breaking the silence. "It's a shock for me as well. She nodded, trying to find her voice. Yeah, you could say that. 25 years is a long time to go without knowing about someone. He looked down, his expression softening, almost regretful. I didn't know your mother was pregnant when we parted ways. If I had known, things would have been different. Different? She wanted to keep her voice neutral, but the hurt slipped through anyway. Because it kind of feels like I just showed up out of nowhere. Daniel nodded, his gaze intense. I understand. And I don't expect you to forgive me or to accept this overnight. But I would like a chance to get to know you, if you're willing. Amelia looked down at the water in her hands, feeling the weight of his words. She'd spent years alone, trying to make peace with the fact that she had no one. And now, just like that, this man wanted to know her. A part of her felt like this was exactly what she'd been waiting for. But the other part, the one that had learned not to trust, told her to be careful. Look, I don't really know what I'm doing here, she admitted. I'm just trying to understand what this all means. Daniel leaned forward, his voice softening. It means that you have a family, Amelia, one that wants you here. And I know that might not be enough right now, but I hope it can be a start. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for the first time she felt her defenses slip just a little. She nodded, forcing herself to meet his gaze. 1 week, she said quietly. I'll give this a week. A flicker of relief crossed his face as he nodded. Thank you, Amelia. That's more than I could have hoped for. Just then, the penthouse door opened, and a tall, dark-haired man walked in, looking around as if he owned the place. He was dressed in an effortlessly tailored suit, his expression a mix of confidence and amusement as his gaze landed on her. This is Ethan Carrington, Daniel said, his tone reserved. He's the son of a family associate. Amelia glanced at him, noting the way his eyes gleamed with curiosity, and maybe just a hint of mischief. He extended a hand, a charming smile playing at his lips. Nice to meet you, Amelia. She took his hand, feeling the strength in his grip. Likewise. So, he said, still holding her hand a second too long. You're the new Hayes on the block. She rolled her eyes, pulling her hand back. I'm here for a week, not exactly moving in. Ethan chuckled, glancing over at Daniel before meeting her gaze again. Well, if you need a tour guide, let me know. I've got a few hidden spots in the city that aren't on the usual maps. Their eyes locked, and she felt a strange thrill, like she'd been invited into some kind of private joke. But then Daniel cleared his throat, pulling them both back to reality. Amelia, he said, a hint of firmness in his tone. I'd like you to join us for a charity event tomorrow evening. I think it would be a good introduction to our world. She nodded, though the idea of a high society event made her stomach flip. Sure, I'll be there. As she left the penthouse, escorted back down to the street, Amelia felt the weight of the city pressing in around her, a strange mix of excitement and fear building inside. She'd come here looking for answers, and now she was tangled up in a world so far removed from her own that it felt like stepping into someone else's life. But one thing was clear, she was in way over her head. Amelia woke up to the sound of traffic and the faint hum of voices drifting up from the Manhattan streets below. She blinked, momentarily disoriented. She'd grown up waking to the chirping of birds and the creak of old floors in foster homes. Now she was in a luxurious hotel room in the middle of New York City, preparing to meet people who expected her to act like she belonged there, as if she'd spent her whole life rubbing elbows with CEOs and billionaires. She sat up, staring out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling window. Everything felt surreal, like she'd been picked up and dropped into a completely different world. And tonight, she barely dared think about it. She'd be going to a charity gala with Daniel Hayes, her long-lost father, who apparently expected her to meet New York's elite as if she were one of them. She let out a shaky breath. 1 week, she reminded herself. She could manage 1 week. That evening, when she arrived at the gala, her nerves were fraying. The venue was a sprawling ballroom, all sparkling chandeliers and polished marble floors. Guests in gowns and tuxedos moved through the space like they belonged there, laughing easily, the kind of people who looked like they'd never experienced a moment of doubt in their lives. Amelia smoothed the fabric of her dress, a sleek navy gown that had arrived at her hotel that morning, courtesy of Daniel. She hadn't owned anything this expensive, much less worn anything that made her look, well, like she fit in. Just as she took a step inside, she heard a familiar voice behind her. You clean up nicely, Hayes. She turned to find Ethan Carrington, looking completely at ease in his tuxedo, hands in his pockets, and that familiar smirk tugging at his lips. He looked like he belonged here, like he could command the whole room with a glance. And yet, somehow, he made her feel like she was the only person he was interested in right now. "You don't look so bad yourself," she replied, trying to sound casual despite the fact that her pulse had just doubled. He gave her a once-over, his smirk softening into a genuine smile. "Ready to charm New York's finest?" She rolled her eyes. "I'm just hoping I don't trip and embarrass myself in front of New York's finest." Ethan chuckled, stepping a bit closer, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "Here's a tip. If you feel like running, just head toward the balcony. No one will follow you out there. It's prime hiding territory." She stifled a laugh. "I'll keep that in mind." Before she could say anything else, Daniel appeared, his gaze settling on her with a touch of pride. "Amelia, you look wonderful," he said, nodding in approval. Then he turned to Ethan, his expression cooling just slightly. "Ethan, good to see you here. Your father must be around somewhere." Ethan's smirk didn't waver. "Yes, I'm sure he is. And I'm sure he's working the room as usual." The tension between them was subtle but unmistakable. Amelia felt caught in the middle, as if they were two opposing forces, each pulling her in a different direction. She glanced at Daniel, catching a flicker of disapproval in his eyes, and her stomach twisted. Was this what her life was going to be? Torn between loyalty to her newfound family and her connection to someone her father clearly didn't trust? "Excuse me," Ethan said, flashing Amelia a wink. "I have to go say a few hellos. Try not to run off without me, Hayes." She watched him slip into the crowd, disappearing among the other guests. Daniel turned to her, his expression softening as he gestured for her to follow him to a small group of people near the stage. She let him guide her, introducing her to a handful of people with names and faces she only half registered. She nodded politely, made small talk, and tried to look like she knew what she was doing. But her mind kept drifting back to Ethan and the easy confidence he'd shown, the way he'd treated her like she was more than just her father's daughter. Later, as she took a break by one of the windows, Ethan appeared beside her again, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "Thirsty?" She accepted the glass, giving him a grateful smile. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you're rescuing me." He raised his glass, a playful glint in his eyes. "Maybe I am. After all, what's a gala without a little excitement?" They clinked glasses, and Amelia took a sip, feeling the bubbles tickle her throat. She glanced around at the room full of polished strangers, all perfectly poised and seemingly oblivious to anything outside their own circle. "I don't know how you do this," she murmured, half to herself. "Do what? Just fit in, like you belong here." Ethan's smile faded, and his gaze turned thoughtful. "You know, fitting in doesn't mean much when you've spent your whole life doing what other people expect of you." She looked up at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. He looked out at the room, his gaze distant, and she saw a flicker of something raw, something that hinted at a side of him she hadn't seen before. "Everyone here thinks they know who I am," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just Ethan Carrington, the heir to the Carrington Empire. But that's not who I want to be." The words hung in the air between them, and Amelia felt a strange sense of connection, as if they were both outsiders in this world, both trying to carve out a place that was truly theirs. "What do you want to be?" she asked softly. He looked back at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Maybe someone who gets to make his own choices. Someone who isn't just following a script. They stood there in silence, the hum of the crowd fading into the background. She'd only known him for a few days, but already, she felt like he was the only one who understood the strange, disorienting journey she'd been thrust into. "Well then," she said, lifting her glass in a mock toast. "Here's to making our own choices." He clinked his glass against hers, a spark of warmth in his gaze. "I'll drink to that." They shared a smile, and for a moment, it was just the two of them, standing on the edge of a world that neither of them quite belonged to. But before she could let herself get too comfortable, Daniel approached, his expression polite but unmistakably tense. "Amelia," he said, giving her a brief smile, "I'd like to introduce you to a few more people." She shot Ethan an apologetic look, and he nodded, his smile fading as he watched her leave. She followed Daniel across the room, trying to push down the strange ache that had settled in her chest. It was silly, she told herself. She barely knew Ethan, and yet somehow, She felt like she'd known him all her life. As the evening wore on, Amelia found herself growing more exhausted by the constant chatter, the expectations that seemed to wrap around her like invisible chains. She'd come here for answers, but instead, she felt like she was being pulled in every direction but her own. Finally, after what felt like hours, she slipped away to the balcony, craving a breath of fresh air. She leaned against the railing, closing her eyes and letting the cool night breeze wash over her, trying to shake the weight of everything she'd felt inside. Taking my advice, I see. She turned to find Ethan standing behind her, a small, knowing smile on his face. Couldn't resist the prime hiding spot, she said with a faint laugh. He stepped up beside her, his gaze focused on the city lights. It's a lot, isn't it? She nodded, feeling the tension ease as they stood in comfortable silence. I thought this trip would bring me closer to, I don't know, something real. But I feel like I'm even farther away. Ethan looked at her, his expression soft. Sometimes finding yourself means getting a little lost first. His words settled over her, a strange comfort in the midst of the chaos. She knew she was only here for a week, just a visitor in a world that wasn't hers. But for the first time, she felt like maybe she didn't have to do it alone. As they returned to the party, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. She was still searching for answers, but now, with Ethan by her side, she felt like she was closer than ever to finding them. By the time Amelia arrived at Hayes Industries the next morning, she'd already downed 2 cups of coffee and given herself about 6 pep talks. She wasn't sure what to expect when Daniel had invited her to visit his office, but her nerves were fraying at the edges. The towering building, sleek and all reflective glass, loomed above her as she stepped inside, feeling like a character in one of those dramas about high-stakes business empires. Only she wasn't here to negotiate a deal. She was here to figure out who this man really was and why he suddenly wanted her in his life. Miss Hayes? The receptionist's voice jolted her out of her thoughts. She looked up, realizing the young woman behind the desk was smiling at her with a sort of reverent politeness that made her feel like a celebrity. Yes, that's me, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. If you'll follow me, Mr. Hayes is waiting for you, the receptionist said, her tone formal, as if Amelia were one of the corporate VIPs who probably walked these halls every day. Amelia followed, feeling more like an imposter with each step. The receptionist led her to a set of double doors at the end of a polished hallway, the sound of her heels echoing in the silence. She barely had time to steady herself before the doors opened, and there was Daniel, standing beside a large mahogany desk in a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The view was breathtaking, a panorama of the city that looked almost surreal in the bright morning light. Amelia, he greeted her with a small, almost tentative smile. Thank you for coming. She gave a brief nod, hoping she looked calm instead of like she was one wrong step away from tripping over her own feet. Of course. He gestured to the seat across from him, and she sat down, clutching her bag in her lap, trying to look like this was something she did every day. Daniel settled into the chair across from her, his gaze steady but softer than she'd expected. I wanted to give you a look at the other side of my life, he began, gesturing to the room around them. This is where I've spent the last 20 years. Building, negotiating, running this company. It's been everything to me. She looked around, taking in the luxurious office space, the sleek furniture, the walls lined with awards and plaques that told the story of a man who had achieved more than most people could even imagine. It was impressive, she couldn't deny that. But as she studied him, she couldn't help but wonder if it was worth the sacrifice. It's beautiful, she said carefully, choosing her words as she glanced at the walls. You've really built something incredible here. Daniel nodded, his gaze growing distant for a moment. Yes, but there's a price. Building this empire required sacrifices I didn't always realize I was making. People I've had to keep at a distance. Moments I missed. His voice softened, a flicker of regret in his eyes. Your mother was one of them. Amelia felt a pang in her chest, a strange mix of sympathy and resentment. Part of her wanted to feel sorry for him, to acknowledge the weight of what he'd lost. But the other part, the part that had grown up without a family, who'd felt the ache of abandonment every day, found it harder to forgive. So, what about now? She asked, her voice steady but quiet. Why bring me into this world now? After all these years? He looked down, his expression momentarily vulnerable. Because I realized that everything I've built means nothing if I have no one to share it with. I know I can't make up for lost time, Amelia, but I want to try. I want you to feel like this is your home too. She looked away, unsure of what to say. The idea of home was something she'd spent years trying to let go of. She'd learned to rely on herself, to build her own foundation without the support of anyone else. And now, suddenly, this man, her father, wanted her to feel like she belonged in his life, in a place that felt as foreign to her as another planet. I don't know if I'm ready for all of this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It's overwhelming. Daniel nodded, his gaze softening. I understand. This isn't something that has to happen overnight. I just want you to have the opportunity to see what's possible, to know that you have a choice. I didn't come looking for you to control you, Amelia. I came looking for you because I wanted to find you. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and Amelia felt her defenses slip just a little. She looked down, processing his words, feeling a mixture of emotions that were impossible to name. I appreciate that, she said finally, glancing up to meet his gaze. But I still need time to figure this out. I've spent my whole life taking care of myself. I can't just change that overnight. He nodded, a faint smile breaking through. Of course. Take all the time you need, and if you ever want to see more of the business at your own pace, I'll be here. Amelia nodded, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over her. She didn't know what this journey would bring, or if she could even find a place in this world he was offering her. But for the first time, she felt a spark of hope, a tiny glimmer that maybe, just maybe, she could build something here that was truly her own. That evening, back at her hotel, Amelia was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the knock on her door until it came a second time. More insistent. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, hands in his pockets, that familiar smirk on his face. I figured I'd find you hiding away. Thought you might need some company. She raised an eyebrow, trying to ignore the sudden flutter in her chest. And what makes you think that? He shrugged, stepping inside as if he'd been invited. Just a hunch. Plus, you've been pretty much bombarded with enough life-changing news for one lifetime. She chuckled, crossing her arms as she leaned against the wall. You're not wrong. He looked around, taking in the sleek, minimalist hotel room. So, how's the crash course in becoming a Hayes going? She sighed, feeling the weight of her father's expectations pressing down on her again. It's a lot. He wants me to be a part of his world, to understand the business and maybe even take it over one day. She shook her head, a faint laugh escaping her. I mean, I can barely keep track of my bank account, and he thinks I can run an empire? Ethan smiled, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Trust me, I get it. My father's been grooming me to take over Carrington Investments since I could walk. The expectations, the pressure, it's suffocating. She looked at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. So, you don't want it either? He hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the window. Let's just say, I have other dreams. But in families like ours, you're not really given a choice. The bitterness in his tone struck a chord in her. She saw past his charm, his confident smirk, to the person who, just like her, felt trapped by expectations he never asked for. Maybe that's why we get along, she said, her voice soft. We're both trying to escape what everyone else wants us to be. Ethan met her gaze, a warm, understanding look in his eyes. Maybe so. He paused, then grinned. So, what do you say we escape for a bit? She raised an eyebrow. Escape? Yeah, he said, his tone light, but his eyes gleaming with mischief. Let me show you the real New York. The parts the Hayes and Carrington families would never approve of. Amelia hesitated, glancing back at the hotel room as if she'd need to ask for permission. Then she looked at him, this stranger who somehow felt like the only person who truly understood her, and nodded. All right, lead the way. They slipped out into the city, laughing and trading stories as they wandered through quiet streets and hidden alleyways. For a few hours, it was just the two of them, free from expectations, from the weight of their families, from everything but the simple joy of being young, and finally, a little bit free. And for the first time, Amelia felt like she'd found someone who truly saw her, not as Daniel Hayes' daughter, but as herself. The following evening, Amelia found herself at another event, this one smaller than the gala, but even more exclusive. Daniel had mentioned it in passing, calling it a close associates dinner. and she wasn't sure what to expect. So far, this week in his world felt like a never-ending lineup of strangers in expensive clothes, all with that same polite, practiced smile. And of course, she didn't need a crystal ball to know that Ethan Carrington would be there too. The dinner was held in one of Manhattan's top restaurants, tucked away in an upscale neighborhood she'd never have dreamed of visiting before. Inside, everything was dimly lit, all dark wood and soft music, with a view of the city that looked like something out of a magazine. Amelia tried to take it all in without gawking, but it was hard to pretend she wasn't blown away. "Enjoying the view?" a familiar voice asked. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Ethan. She could tell just by the way her pulse sped up and her nerves steadied all at once. "Yes, actually," she replied, flashing a small smile. "New York does look better when you're above all the chaos." "Then let me help you enjoy it." He handed her a glass of champagne, his expression light, but his eyes holding that familiar glint of mischief. "Thanks," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral. But as she took a sip, she realized that this felt different, easier somehow, like she was finally letting herself breathe. As the dinner progressed, Ethan took the seat beside her, offering occasional commentary on the guests, making her laugh quietly as he pointed out their quirks with deadpan humor. Every time he leaned in, she caught the faint scent of his cologne, crisp and clean, and she wondered how someone could look so at ease while also seeming so different from everyone else in the room. It wasn't until after the main course that the conversation shifted in a direction that snapped Amelia out of her comfortable haze. Daniel stood, raising a glass as he addressed the table. "Friends, as you know, Hayes Industries has always been a family business. It's been my life's work, and it's given me everything I could ever ask for. And tonight, I'm proud to have my daughter here with us, taking her first steps into this world." The room erupted in polite applause, and Amelia forced a smile, nodding to the guests as she felt her cheeks heat up. She glanced at Ethan, hoping to find some reassurance, but his face was unreadable. After Daniel sat down, an older woman with keen eyes and a sharp smile leaned across the table toward Amelia. "It must be quite the change for you, my dear. I'm sure stepping into the Hayes legacy is overwhelming." Amelia managed a polite nod. "It's definitely a new experience." "Oh, don't worry," she said with a laugh. "You'll get used to it. It's in your blood, after all." Amelia's stomach twisted. In her blood? She didn't even know if this world was in her soul, much less her blood. She looked down, searching for a response that wouldn't sound ungrateful. But Ethan's voice cut through the tension first. "Amelia's still finding her way," he said smoothly, his gaze flicking to hers with a faint smile. "But she's smart. She's figuring out where she belongs." The woman's smile faltered, clearly caught off guard. "Well, yes, of course." Amelia felt a surge of relief and gratitude toward Ethan, and she gave him a small, grateful nod. He returned it with a slight, reassuring smile, his expression softening as their eyes met. Later, after the dinner had ended and most of the guests had trickled out, Ethan found her by the window, watching the city lights. "You survived," he said, his tone playful. She chuckled, shaking her head. "Barely. I think I almost folded under the pressure back there." He raised an eyebrow, studying her for a moment. "You don't have to pretend, you know. You're allowed to feel out of place. I've spent my entire life surrounded by these people, and I still feel like an outsider half the time." "Really?" she asked, surprised. "You seem so comfortable, like you belong here." He shrugged, his gaze drifting to the city below. "I play the part. But if I'm honest, I don't know if I want any of this." Amelia looked at him, trying to understand the person behind the confident facade. "So why stay?" He hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "Because it's expected. Because it's easier to play along than to fight it." She nodded, understanding more than he realized. "Yeah, I get that. I've spent most of my life trying to fit into places where I didn't belong. I've been so good at it. I don't even know what I want anymore." They stood in silence, each lost in thought, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance. For a moment, Amelia felt like they were the only two people in the world, connected by a shared sense of being out of place. Ethan's voice broke the silence, his tone softer than before. "Do you ever think about just leaving? Starting over somewhere far away from all this?" She laughed, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "Constantly. But it's hard to start over when you don't know where you're going." He looked at her, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Maybe that's why we're supposed to meet each other. Two people trying to figure out where they belong. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. A spark of recognition, of understanding that went beyond words. She felt her defenses soften, her guard slipping as she let herself simply be. No expectations, no pretenses. Just Amelia and Ethan, two people trying to make sense of a world they didn't quite belong to. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "For tonight." He smiled, his gaze warm. "Anytime." As they walked back to her hotel together, their hands brushed, lingering a second too long before she pulled away, her heart pounding. She felt a mix of nerves and excitement, a sensation she hadn't let herself feel in years. And as they reached her hotel, she looked up at him, unsure of what to say. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Listen, Amelia, if you ever need someone to talk to, or just someone to distract you from all this, I'm here." She smiled, a small, genuine smile. "I appreciate that." They stood there for a moment, both unwilling to leave, until finally he nodded, stepping back. "Good night, Amelia." "Good night, Ethan." As she watched him disappear down the street, Amelia felt a strange sense of hope bubbling up inside her. She knew better than to rely on anyone else. She'd built her entire life around that belief. But with Ethan, it felt different. Like maybe, just maybe, she'd found someone who understood her without expecting her to change. She returned to her room, settling onto the edge of the bed, lost in thought. The city lights flickered outside her window, casting a warm glow over the room. And for the first time since arriving, she felt a flicker of excitement about what tomorrow might bring. The next day, Amelia returned to Hayes Industries, determined to approach things on her terms. She hadn't yet decided if she wanted to be part of her father's world, but she knew she needed to see it through, if only to figure out what she truly wanted. Daniel welcomed her with a smile, but his gaze held a hint of uncertainty, as if he were trying to gauge her commitment. "Good morning," he said, nodding for her to sit as he reviewed a document on his desk. "I'm glad you're here. Today, I thought you might like to meet a few people on the team." "Sure," she replied, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. As Daniel introduced her to executives, analysts, and managers, she began to see the intricate web of relationships and responsibilities that made up his empire. Everyone she met greeted her with a mix of awe and curiosity, as if they weren't quite sure where she fit, but were determined to find out. By the end of the day, Amelia was exhausted but oddly energized. She'd spent years on the outside looking in, wondering what it would be like to belong to something bigger than herself. Now, she was getting a glimpse of that world, a world where she had the chance to make a difference, to find her own path. She returned to her hotel, her mind buzzing with possibilities. For the first time, the idea of staying in New York didn't seem so far-fetched. She had her father, a potential role in his company, and perhaps someone who saw her for who she really was. As she drifted off to sleep, Amelia felt a newfound sense of purpose, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could build a life that was truly her own. For the next few days, Amelia threw herself into learning the ropes at Hayes Industries, meeting her father's team and trying to understand what it was like to be part of his world. She'd felt like an outsider for so long, and even though she wasn't sure if she belonged here, part of her was beginning to warm to the idea of it. She was starting to see Daniel not just as a stranger with the title of father, but as a man who genuinely wanted to know her, even if his methods were still a bit complicated. And then there was Ethan. He had a way of showing up just when she needed him, slipping into her day with a smirk and a joke, as if he were daring her to let go of her doubts and simply enjoy his company. She told herself to keep her guard up, but with him, it was hard. It was like he understood exactly what she was going through without her having to explain a thing. But everything changed the morning her father summoned her to his office, his face unreadable as he gestured for her to sit. She could tell something was different. His usual calm, controlled demeanor was tense, like he was bracing himself for a fight. "Amelia," he began, his tone carefully measured, "I need to speak with you about Ethan Carrington." Her stomach twisted at the mention of Ethan's name, a faint feeling of dread settling over her. "What about him?" Daniel leaned forward, his gaze intent. "The Carrington family has been in competition with ours for years. Philip Carrington, Ethan's father, has always had his eye on Hayes Industries, looking for any weakness he can exploit. He's ruthless, Amelia. And Ethan," he paused, his face hardening. I'm concerned he may not be as genuine as he appears. She felt her pulse quicken, anger sparking at the implication. Ethan's been nothing but kind to me. He's helped me adjust to all of this. Why would you think he's trying to manipulate me? Because I know Philip Carrington, Daniel replied, his tone sharp. And I know the lengths he'd go to in order to get an advantage. Ethan may seem charming, but he's still his father's son. And you, he softened, his expression becoming almost pleading. You're my daughter. I won't let anyone use you, Amelia. Not even him. Amelia stared at her father, a mixture of emotions churning inside her. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he was just trying to protect her. But she also couldn't ignore how real things felt with Ethan, how he seemed to understand her in ways no one else did. Was that all just an act? Are you saying he's only spending time with me because his father told him to? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's jaw tightened. I can't say that for certain, but I wouldn't put it past Philip to use his own son if it meant gaining an advantage over me. I need you to be cautious, Amelia. Don't let yourself be taken in by a pretty face and smooth words. People in this world don't always show you their true intentions. She looked away, feeling her throat tighten. I appreciate your concern, Daniel, but I think I'm capable of making my own decisions. Just be careful, he said quietly. I don't want to see you hurt. She nodded, unable to meet his gaze as she stood and left his office, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of doubt and anger. The warning lingered in her mind, stirring a storm of questions she wasn't sure she wanted the answers to. Part of her knew her father was right to be cautious, but the other part, the part that had felt something real with Ethan, couldn't believe it was all a lie. Later that evening, Amelia found herself outside the Carrington family's Manhattan office building, the doubt gnawing at her so strongly that she couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to get them by second-guessing herself. When she reached the reception desk, she took a deep breath. I'm here to see Ethan Carrington. The receptionist glanced up, barely hiding her surprise. He's in his office, 15th floor. Amelia rode the elevator in silence, each floor that passed only heightening her sense of urgency. By the time she reached Ethan's office, she felt her heart pounding in her chest. She knocked, and when he opened the door, his face lit up in surprise. Amelia, I didn't expect to see you here. She forced a smile, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. I wanted to talk to you. There's something I need to ask. Ethan's smile faded, replaced with a look of concern. What's wrong? She took a deep breath, steadying herself. My father. He told me he thinks you're only spending time with me because of your family, because your father wants an advantage over him. Is that true? Ethan's face froze, the color draining slightly as he took in her words. For a moment, he didn't say anything, his gaze flicking away from hers, and in that silence, she felt the answer settle over her, cold and heavy. Amelia, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not that simple. Her chest tightened, a bitter sense of betrayal rising inside her. So it's true. You were just using me? He stepped closer, reaching out, but she pulled back, her voice trembling. Ethan, I trusted you. I thought you understood what it was like to be caught between two worlds, to want something real. And now you're telling me that this whole time, you were just following orders? It's not like that, he insisted, his voice pleading. Yes, my father wanted me to keep an eye on you at first, but that was before I knew you, before I realized. He trailed off, his gaze searching hers with a desperate intensity. Before I realized how much you mean to me. She shook her head, feeling the walls she'd built around her heart snap back into place. I don't know if I can believe that, Ethan. How do I know you're not just saying what I want to hear? Because I wouldn't be here, standing in front of you, if this wasn't real, he replied, his voice fierce. I care about you, Amelia. I know I should have told you from the beginning, but I was scared. Scared of losing the one good thing in my life that wasn't just about power, or money, or family politics. His words echoed in her mind, filling her with a confusion that felt like it was tearing her apart. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that what they'd shared was real. But the doubts, her father's warnings, her own fears, were too strong to ignore. I can't do this, she whispered, stepping back. I need time. I need to think. Amelia, please, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Don't let this ruin what we have. I'll prove to you that it's real. Just don't walk away. She hesitated, her heart pounding as she looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of deceit. But all she saw was a man who looked as lost and vulnerable as she felt. And yet, she couldn't shake the fear that she was being played, that she'd let herself get too close, only to end up hurt. Without another word, she turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the hallway as she walked away from him, leaving him standing alone in his office. By the time she reached the street, her vision was blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She'd let herself believe in something she knew better than to trust, let her guard down in a world that didn't know the meaning of loyalty. And now, she was paying the price. As she walked through the city, the weight of her father's warning pressed down on her, the realization settling over her like a heavy, bitter truth. In a world like this, trust wasn't just a risk, it was a luxury she couldn't afford. Amelia spent the next few days trying to shake off the conversation with Ethan, but his words echoed in her mind no matter how hard she tried to forget them. She threw herself into work, attending meetings, shadowing Daniel, doing anything she could to keep herself busy. But even in the midst of the bustling Hayes Industries offices, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she'd walked away from something real. But what choice did she have? Her father had warned her, and in his world, trust was a luxury. It felt like there were invisible boundaries she couldn't cross, rules she couldn't break. If she stayed here, if she truly wanted to become part of this life, she couldn't afford to let anyone in, not even someone who felt as real as Ethan. One night, feeling more lost than ever, she decided to take a walk through Central Park. She wandered the winding paths, the city lights casting a glow through the trees. In the quiet of the evening, she finally let herself feel the ache that had been building up inside her, the sense of betrayal, the sadness, the anger. She wanted so badly to belong somewhere, to find something that felt true, and she'd thought, maybe, she'd found that in Ethan. As she sat on a bench, trying to sort through her thoughts, she felt her phone buzz. She glanced down to see a message from Ethan. Ethan, I know you don't want to talk, but I need you to know I meant everything I said. Please let me prove it to you. Amelia stared at the message, her heart aching. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that someone in this world of secrets and hidden motives actually saw her for who she was. But that tiny voice of doubt whispered in her mind, reminding her of her father's warning. 2 days later, she was surprised to find Ethan waiting for her in the lobby of Hayes Industries. His eyes held a determination she hadn't seen before, as if he were ready to fight for something, even if it meant facing her father's disapproval. Amelia, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Can we talk? She hesitated, glancing around at the polished floors, the pristine glass walls, all the details that seemed to remind her of the rules of this world. Ethan, I don't think this is the right place. He nodded, understanding. Then come with me, just for a few minutes. I have something I need to say, and I'd rather say it where your father isn't watching. Against her better judgment, she nodded, following him out of the building and into the cool night air. They walked in silence for a few blocks, until they reached a quiet park tucked away from the busy streets. Ethan stopped, turning to face her, his expression serious. I know I messed up, he began, his gaze steady. And I understand why you feel betrayed, but I can't let you walk away without telling you the truth. Amelia folded her arms, steeling herself against the warmth in his voice. And what's the truth, Ethan? He took a deep breath, his face filled with regret. Yes, my father wanted me to keep an eye on you. And yes, I went along with it, at first. But the more I got to know you, the more I realized I couldn't be the person he wanted me to be. I didn't want to be his pawn. I just wanted to be with you, without all the games, without all the expectations. She looked down, the words cutting deeper than she'd expected. Part of her wanted to forgive him, to believe that he was telling the truth. But trust wasn't something she could just give, not in a world that had taught her to guard herself. I don't know if I can believe you, she said quietly, her voice trembling. How do I know you're not just saying what I want to hear? Ethan stepped closer, his expression filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. Because I'm willing to walk away from everything, Amelia. From my father, from the life he's built for me. If being with you means giving up everything I've known, then I'll do it. Just give me the chance to prove it. She looked up, her heart racing as she met his gaze. The sincerity in his eyes was undeniable, and for a moment, all her doubts faded away. But then her father's warning echoed in her mind, reminding her of the risks. What about your family? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What about everything you stand to lose? Ethan took her hands in his grip steady and warm. None of it matters if I can't be with you. I've spent my whole life doing what other people expected of me, following a path that was never really mine. But with you, it's different. You make me feel like I can be more than just another Carrington. Amelia felt her defenses crumble, her heart pounding as she searched his face. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let go of the doubts that had been holding her back. But she couldn't ignore the fear that had been woven into her life from the beginning. The fear of letting someone in, only to be hurt. Ethan, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know if I'm ready for this. I don't know if I can risk it. He nodded, his face filled with understanding. I know, and I don't expect you to just take my word for it. But I'm here, Amelia. I'll wait for as long as it takes. Just don't walk away without giving us a chance. They stood there in silence, the weight of his words settling over them. She wanted to trust him, to let herself believe in something real, but part of her was still afraid, still holding back. Finally, she took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. Okay, I'll give us a chance, but this has to be on my terms. Ethan's face lit up with relief, and he nodded, his grip on her hands tightening. I wouldn't have it any other way. For the first time in days, Amelia felt a flicker of hope. She didn't know what the future held, and she wasn't sure if she could fully trust him yet. But she was willing to try, to take a step forward, even if it meant risking her heart. And that night, they walked through the city together, talking about their dreams, their fears, the future they wanted to build. It felt like the beginning of something new, something that didn't rely on their families or their pasts. For once, she felt like she was carving out her own path, with someone who understood her in ways no one else did. But as they reached her hotel, a sense of reality settled over her. There would be challenges ahead, moments when her loyalty to her father and her connection to Ethan would clash. She didn't know if she was strong enough to navigate that divide, but for now, she was willing to try. As they stood on the steps of her hotel, Ethan looked down at her, his expression soft. Amelia, whatever happens, I'm with you. I'm choosing you. Always. She felt her heart swell, her fears fading just a little. She didn't know if things would work out, if she could truly trust him. But for the first time, she felt like she was making a choice that was hers alone. A choice that wasn't defined by her past or her father's expectations. Thank you, Ethan, she whispered, reaching up to press a soft kiss to his cheek. For being here. For being you. They shared a small, understanding smile, and she felt a warmth settle in her chest. A feeling she hadn't known she'd been missing. She was still Amelia Hayes, a girl with a complicated past and an uncertain future. But with Ethan by her side, she felt a little more whole. As she watched him disappear down the street, a small smile lingered on her lips. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she was ready to face it. One step at a time. Amelia woke up the next morning with a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of peace. It was fragile, like something that could vanish if she let herself think too much about it. But for now, she wanted to hold on to it. Her week in New York had been nothing like she'd expected. Instead of finding a family, she'd stumbled into a world full of contradictions, secrets, and unexpected connections. Today, Daniel had invited her to his country estate, a place he'd described with a kind of fondness she hadn't expected. When the driver pulled up to the sprawling property, she felt like she was stepping into another world. The mansion was set on acres of carefully manicured lawns, surrounded by gardens and old oak trees that seemed to whisper of past lives. As she climbed out of the car, Daniel was waiting for her, his hands in his pockets, a small, tentative smile on his face. He looked different out here, away from the polished marble and glass walls of his office. She could almost imagine him as a regular man, someone who might have enjoyed lazy afternoons and quiet walks before the weight of Hayes Industries had settled on his shoulders. Amelia, he greeted her, his voice softer than usual. I'm glad you could come. She gave him a small nod, feeling the weight of everything unspoken between them. It's beautiful out here. He looked around, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Your mother loved this place. She used to say it was the only place where she felt free. The mention of her mother tugged at something deep inside her, a reminder of the family she'd never known. She wished she could picture her mother here, walking these gardens, maybe laughing in a way Amelia had never seen. But the image was just out of reach. a ghost she couldn't quite catch. "What was she like?" Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel looked down, his face softening. "She was remarkable, kind, compassionate. She believed in people, even me, when I didn't believe in myself. Losing her," he trailed off, his gaze distant. "It changed me. I threw myself into my work, convinced that building this empire would somehow make up for the emptiness she left behind. But now, I realize, I was wrong." Amelia felt a pang in her chest, a mixture of sympathy and resentment. She'd spent years trying to piece together a family out of fragments, wondering why no one had been there to care for her. And now, here was this man, this stranger who called himself her father, confessing that he'd lost something too. "I spent a lot of years wishing someone would come for me," she said quietly, looking down. "But eventually I just stopped hoping. I learned to be okay on my own." Daniel's face filled with regret, and he reached out, hesitating before placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I can't change the past, Amelia, but I want to be here now. I want to be the father you should have had." She looked up, meeting his gaze. There was a vulnerability there, a raw honesty she hadn't seen before. For the first time, she felt like he wasn't just trying to protect his legacy or make up for lost time. He was simply a man who wanted to know his daughter. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being honest." They spent the afternoon walking the grounds, talking about everything and nothing. Her childhood, his work, even memories of her mother that felt both foreign and familiar. By the time the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the estate, Amelia felt like a weight had lifted. She didn't know if she could forgive him for the years they'd lost, but she knew she wanted to try, and that was enough. That evening, she met Ethan for dinner at a cozy cafe tucked away in one of Manhattan's quieter neighborhoods. He'd found the place after wandering through the city one night, and she could see why he'd chosen it. It was intimate, with low lighting, jazz music, and the scent of freshly baked bread filling the air. They settled into a booth, and she felt her earlier worries melt away as they talked, laughing about their misadventures in high society and sharing stories of small-town memories that seemed a world away from the city around them. For the first time since she'd arrived in New York, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not just in the city, but in this moment, with him. "So," Ethan said, raising an eyebrow as he leaned back, "how did things go with your father?" Amelia smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't expected. "It was good. Complicated, but good. I think we're finally starting to understand each other." Ethan nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. "I'm glad. You deserve to have someone who's there for you." She looked down, feeling a rush of gratitude for the person sitting across from her. He'd been there, even when she'd pushed him away, and somehow he'd always managed to see the person she was, not the role she was supposed to play. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being here, for everything." He reached across the table, his hand closing gently around hers. "Always." They spent the rest of the evening talking about their dreams, their plans, and the life they wanted to build outside of their family's legacies. For the first time, Amelia felt like she could picture a future that was truly hers, a life built on her choices, her values, and her dreams. As they left the cafe, walking hand in hand through the city streets, Amelia felt a sense of hope she hadn't known she'd been missing. She didn't know what the future held, but with Ethan by her side, she felt ready to face it. The next day, Daniel surprised her by inviting her to one of Hayes Industries' charity events. A smaller, quieter affair compared to the gala, but still filled with the city's elite. She felt her nerves creeping back as she stepped into the room, feeling like an outsider once again. But this time, Daniel stayed by her side, introducing her to colleagues, old friends, and even a few board members who seemed genuinely curious about her. At one point, as they were talking to an older couple, Daniel put a gentle hand on her shoulder, glancing down with a look of quiet pride. "This is my daughter, Amelia," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "She's just starting to learn about the company, but I have no doubt she'll make a difference." The words settled over her, filling her with a strange sense of belonging. For years, she'd been searching for a place where she fit, a family she could call her own. And now, standing beside her father, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found it. Later that evening, as she returned to her hotel, Amelia felt a deep sense of peace. She'd come to New York looking for answers, for a connection to her past, and she'd found more than she'd ever imagined. She had a father who wanted to know her, a man who saw her for who she really was, and a chance to build a life on her terms. As she looked out at the city skyline, she felt a sense of clarity settle over her. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still parts of herself she was piecing together. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had a future here, one that was defined by her choices and the people she loved. With a small, grateful smile, she closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the past finally lift, replaced by the promise of everything that lay ahead. Amelia stood on the terrace of her father's penthouse, looking out at the Manhattan skyline as the first light of dawn cast a warm, golden hue over the city. She hadn't slept much, her mind buzzing with everything that had happened over the past few days. The more time she spent in New York, the more she felt like she was beginning to understand this world and her place in it. It was strange to think about how much had changed in such a short time. Only a week ago, she'd been in Caldwell, waiting tables, leading a life that felt safe and small. But now, standing here, she felt like a new version of herself, a version she was only just getting to know. She had a father who was trying to make up for lost time, a man who understood her, and a city that was slowly beginning to feel like home. Daniel joined her on the terrace, carrying 2 mugs of coffee, his expression softened by the early morning light. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, handing her a mug. She smiled, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Too much to think about." He nodded, gazing out at the skyline. This city has that effect on people. It's overwhelming, exciting, intimidating, all at once. They sipped their coffee in comfortable silence, the quiet moments between them feeling more natural now. Over the past week, they'd found a rhythm, an understanding that didn't need words. And for the first time, Amelia felt like she didn't have to keep her guard up around him. After a while, Daniel spoke, his tone thoughtful. "You know, I never thought I'd have this chance," he said, glancing at her. "To know my daughter, to see her in this world I've spent my life building. It's more than I ever could have asked for." Amelia looked down, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I'm still trying to figure out where I fit into all of this," she admitted. "I'm not sure if I'm ready to dive into the family business just yet." Daniel smiled, his expression understanding. "You don't have to decide anything right now. Take your time. This world isn't easy, and it's not for everyone. I just want you to know that whatever you choose, you'll always have a place here." She nodded, feeling a sense of relief. There was a freedom in his words, a promise that she could forge her own path without losing the connection they'd started to build. And for the first time, she felt like she could imagine a future here. A future where she wasn't just Daniel Hayes' daughter, but Amelia, a person with her own dreams and ambitions. Later that day, she met Ethan at a small cafe they'd found on one of their walks. It was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, with mismatched chairs and walls covered in old, faded photographs. She'd come to love this place, not because of the decor or the coffee, but because it felt like their own little escape from the world. Ethan greeted her with a smile as she slid into the seat across from him. "How's the crash course on being a Hayes going?" She chuckled, rolling her eyes. "Intense. I don't know if I'll ever get used to all of this." "Trust me," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "I get it. I've spent my whole life in this world, and I still don't feel like I belong half the time." They shared a laugh, the ease between them a comforting reminder that she didn't have to face all of this alone. He had a way of making her feel like she could be herself, like she didn't have to pretend to be anyone other than Amelia. And for someone who'd spent most of her life feeling out of place, that was a gift she couldn't put into words. They talked about everything, their dreams, their fears, the things that kept them up at night. And as the hours passed, she found herself opening up to him in a way she hadn't with anyone else. It was as if the walls she'd built around herself were slowly crumbling, making room for something new, something real. When they left the cafe, they wandered through the city, talking about their plans for the future. Ethan spoke about his idea of starting a nonprofit to support local artists and small businesses, a project he'd been dreaming about for years, but had never felt brave enough to pursue. "You'd be perfect for that," she said, admiration in her eyes. "You have this way of making people feel seen, like they matter." He looked at her, a soft smile on his face. "That's how you make me feel, Amelia." Her heart skipped a beat, a warmth spreading through her that chased away any lingering doubts. In a world where so much was uncertain, The one thing she felt sure of was him. As they reached her hotel, Ethan paused, turning to face her. "Amelia, whatever happens, I want you to know. I'm here. For you. I'm all in." She felt her heart swell, his words filling the spaces that had been empty for so long. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that, for the first time, she wasn't alone. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching up to press a gentle kiss to his cheek. "For being here. For being you." They shared a small, understanding smile, and she felt a warmth settle in her chest, a feeling she hadn't known she'd been missing. She was still Amelia Hayes, a girl with a complicated past and an uncertain future. But with Ethan by her side, she felt a little more whole. Over the next few days, Amelia began to find her rhythm in New York. She spent her mornings shadowing her father, learning the ins and outs of Hayes Industries, and her evenings with Ethan, exploring the city and talking about their dreams. She was still finding her footing, still trying to figure out what she wanted, but she no longer felt like she had to do it alone. One evening, Daniel surprised her by inviting her to a small family dinner. It was just the two of them, a quiet affair compared to the bustling charity events she'd attended, and for the first time, she felt like they were just two people, not a father and daughter trying to make up for lost time. As they talked, Daniel shared stories of his early days building the company, his struggles, his triumphs, and the lessons he'd learned along the way. Amelia listened, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and admiration. She'd always thought of him as a powerful businessman, someone distant and unreachable. But tonight, he felt real, human, vulnerable. At the end of the evening, as they were saying their goodbyes, Daniel placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Amelia, I want you to know, you don't have to be anyone but yourself. Whatever you choose, wherever you go, you'll always have a place here." She nodded, a small, grateful smile on her face. For the first time, she felt like she had a family, a place where she belonged. It wasn't perfect, and there were still pieces of her past she needed to make peace with, but it was a start. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Amelia felt a sense of clarity settle over her. She didn't have all the answers, and the future was still uncertain, but she had a father who believed in her, a man who saw her for who she really was, and a city that felt a little more like home with each passing day. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, she was excited to find out. Amelia stood on the rooftop of Ethan's apartment building, gazing out over the New York City skyline as the sun set, casting a warm, golden light over the buildings. The city seemed alive, pulsing with energy as lights flickered on one by one. It had only been a week since she'd arrived, but it felt like a lifetime, a whirlwind of discoveries, both thrilling and painful. Ethan appeared beside her, slipping his hand into hers. "You look like you're 1,000 miles away," he said softly. She smiled, glancing up at him. "I guess I am. Just thinking about everything that's happened. It feels like I'm finally starting to understand who I am, but at the same time, I have no idea what comes next." He squeezed her hand, his gaze filled with warmth. "Whatever it is, you don't have to figure it out alone. I'm here." The words settled over her, a simple promise that felt more real than anything she'd ever known. She didn't have to face the future alone, and for the first time, she felt a sense of peace, a feeling that she didn't have to have all the answers right now. They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the city lights flicker on below them, a reminder of the journey she'd taken to get here. She'd come to New York in search of answers, a place to belong, and she'd found something even more profound. A family, a future, and a love that felt like home. A few weeks later, Amelia began taking on more responsibility at Hayes Industries, joining a small team working on sustainable urban development, a project she felt passionate about. She was learning at her own pace, feeling her way through the world of business, but always with the assurance that Daniel respected her boundaries. Their relationship was still new, still fragile in some ways, but she felt a connection growing between them that went beyond the titles of father and daughter. They were learning to be a family, one step at a time. Ethan, too, had started making moves toward his dream, working on the foundation he'd envisioned, a nonprofit to support local artists and small businesses. He invited her to brainstorming sessions, sharing his plans and getting her input. And together, they began to shape a vision that felt meaningful, authentic, and wholly theirs. One evening, as they sat in his small, cozy apartment, Ethan looked over at her, his expression thoughtful. You know, if someone had told me a few months ago that I'd be doing this, starting a foundation, building a life outside my family's expectations, I wouldn't have believed them. She smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. And yet, here we are. He chuckled, his gaze warm as he looked at her. You changed everything, Amelia. You made me believe I could choose my own path. Her heart swelled, a mixture of pride and gratitude filling her. In this city of lights and expectations, they had found each other. Two people searching for something real, something true. And together, they'd built a life that felt like it was theirs alone. One afternoon, Daniel invited her back to the country estate for a quiet weekend. As they walked through the gardens, he shared stories of his early days, the struggles he'd faced, and the moments he'd doubted himself. Amelia listened, feeling a new sense of understanding, not just for him, but for the sacrifices he'd made along the way. They stopped by the pond, where the water shimmered under the afternoon sun. Daniel turned to her, a look of pride in his eyes. Amelia, I want you to know, you've given me something I never thought I'd have. A chance to know my daughter, to be part of her life. It means more than you'll ever know. She felt a lump form in her throat, her chest tight with emotion. Thank you, Daniel, for giving me this chance. I know it hasn't been easy, but I'm glad we found each other. They stood there in silence, a father and daughter learning to make up for lost time, building a future based not on expectations, but on choice and understanding. That night, as she lay in bed, Amelia thought about the journey she'd taken, the choices she'd made, and the future that lay ahead. She'd spent her life searching for something she couldn't name, a place to belong, and now she finally felt like she'd found it. Not just in the Hayes name, or in the wealth and power that came with it, but in the relationships she'd built, the people who'd shown her what it meant to be truly seen. As she drifted off to sleep, a quiet peace settled over her. She didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But she knew one thing for sure. She was exactly where she was meant to be, and she was ready to face whatever came next, with love, purpose, and the strength of everything she'd learned. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription will show that I'm on the right path to bring you the best videos ever. Check this video out too. A Parisian jeweler who risked everything for a mysterious woman with a deadly secret. Ethan was just an ordinary craftsman until Isabel walked into his shop, an heiress trapped in a web of lies and corruption.